This is a characteristic phenomenon of honeybees, Apis mellifera, and has a specific biological mechanism behind it. There are more than 20,000 known species of bees worldwide, but only some of them, including honeybees, bumblebees, and stingless bees, have a barbed stinger. And not all of these bees die after stinging. So why do honeybees die after stinging? Why don't they just fly away before the sting? And what actually happens to their body after they're stung? Well, to understand how a bee dies when it stings, we first need to look at the structure of a bee's stinger. A honeybee's stinger has tiny barbs at the tip that help it anchor firmly into the skin of its target. Now, if the bee stings something small and squishy like a flower, the stinger will go in and come right back out without any problems. But when the bee stings something bigger and tougher, like a person or an animal, the stinger can get stuck inside the skin and the bee can't pull it out. That's because the skin on humans and other large animals is thicker than the exoskeleton of most insects. And here's the problem. When the bee pulls on its stinger to try to pull it out of the thick skin, part of its abdomen gets torn off, along with the guts and the other internal organs that are attached to it. In other words, the act of trying to pull the stinger out ends up killing the bee. It rips its insides out of its body. The bee loses control of its wings and legs and falls to the ground, crashing to its doom. But here's the kicker. Even after the bee dies, the stinger continues to pump venom into the wound for a few seconds. This is because the stinger is connected to the bee's venom sac by a thin tube filled with venom. So when the bee pulls its stinger out of the wound, the venom sac gets squeezed, forcing the remaining venom out of the tube and into the wound. This means that the sting can keep hurting and irritating the victim long after the bee is dead. But why do bees have such dangerous stingers in the first place? Well, it turns out that the tough skin of vertebrates, like the scales on a fish, or the feathers on a bird, or the hair on a mammal, is actually pretty difficult for bees to pierce. So bees evolved barbed stingers to help them get through this tough outer layer of protection so that they could get to the squishy bits underneath where they could actually do some damage. Unfortunately for bees, though, this also means that they often get their stingers stuck in the tough stuff, which can kill them. But there might be an even bigger reason why bees have barbed stingers. You see, when a bee stings someone, the pain and irritation from the sting can bring in other bees to help defend their stinging mate. This is called alarm pheromone signaling. Alarm pheromones are chemical signals that are released by an attacked individual to alert other members of its colony or species. Pheromones are basically like a bee's version of calling 911 for backup. When a bee stings someone, it releases a pheromone that recruits other bees to come and defend it. The idea is that when one bee is attacked, the other bees in the colony will come and help defend it. This is important because protecting the colony is more important than any single bee's life. So some scientists think that the barbed stinger may have evolved partly to ensure that the bee doesn't survive the sting. After all, if the bee survives, it won't need backup, the ultimate sacrifice. It may seem counterintuitive, but the fact that bees die after stinging may actually be an advantage for the colony as a whole. When an individual bee dies, its body can produce even more pheromones, which recruits even more defenders. Plus, the dead bee's stinger is still lodged in the skin of the victim, so it can continue to hurt and irritate the attacker long after the bee is dead. This means that the attackers will have less time to regroup and launch a counterattack, giving the rest of the colony time to escape. In other words, the bee colony can benefit from the death of one of its members. Of course, this doesn't mean that every single bee dies after stinging. There are plenty of species of bees, like wasps and hornets, that have smooth stingers and can sting multiple times without dying. Their stingers are more like hypodermic needles, and they can inject their venom into their victims without getting their bodies torn apart. Wasps and hornets typically only have 2 or 3 segments in their abdomen, while honeybees usually have 5 or 6. This makes it easier for them to sting multiple times. Not only that, but their stings are shorter and sharper than those of honeybees, so they're better at piercing the tough outer layers of vertebrates. They can even sting through clothing, which is why it's always a good idea to remove your beekeeper suit as soon as possible after an angry hornet's nest has been disturbed. Now, it may seem like a big disadvantage to have a stinger that's likely to rip your guts out if you use it, but it's possible that the benefits of the stinger outweigh the risks. For one thing, the stinger is only barbed at the tip. The rest of it is smooth, so it can still move freely inside the body of a small insect. And the stinger isn't really used for defense anyway. Bees only use their stingers for offense. So it's only really risky when they sting something large and tough, like a human or a bird or a mammal. But even then, it's still possible for a bee to pull its stinger out before it gets ripped apart. If the bee is small enough and the skin of the victim isn't too thick, the bee can pull its stinger out before any serious damage is done. It's only when the skin is very thick and tough, like the skin of a rhino or an elephant, that the bee is likely to get its stinger stuck and ripped apart. So even though honeybees have barbed stingers that can kill them, they only die when they sting something big and tough like us. When they sting smaller, softer targets like other insects, they don't get their stingers stuck and torn off. So the risk of death is much lower. And if you thought this was gross, stick around in next video when we're going to talk about botflies. These nasty parasites can lay eggs on your skin, burrow face down in your pores, suck your oil, then pop out of your skin to lay their eggs somewhere else. I'm going to save the worst parts for the video, but if you want to know more about botflies, check out our other video. Thanks for watching.